This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
I'm Tom Hoppy, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. From our past show, the audience has provided some great feedback on how the information on this show has helped them. Now, we focused on chronic pain managed in Canada, but how is chronic pain managed in other countries? Are the treatments the same? The USVA has changed their approach to how they manage chronic pain. And to talk about this today, we are joined by retired Surgeon General from the U.S. Army, Eric Schoomaker. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for inviting me. This is a pleasure and a privilege.
Well, it's great to have you on the show, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I know we talked off camera about some of the changes that happened. I find it really exciting. So can you explain to us why the USVA has kind of changed the way how they deal with chronic pain?
Oh, no, I'd be happy to do so, Tom. But I have to explain for the benefit of your audience that in the United States, the active duty component of service to the nation, whether it's in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, the Public Health Service, the Coast Guard, and now the new Space Command, is under the auspices of the Department of Defense. So all active duty and their families, as well as retirees such as me and my wife, are cared for by the Department of Defense. But when we retire, or more often serve for a period of time that doesn't entitle one to full retirement benefits, we transition into a separate executive agency of the federal government, the Department of Veterans Affairs. That's a little different than it is, I believe, in Canada. The Department of Veterans Affairs has taken historically a very aggressive and I think very far-sighted approach to the treatment of pain. They recognized, as many did in the civilian sector, that after a period of time after acute injury, such as a fracture or post-operative pain, a combat wound, for example, after weeks to months, if pain persists, it becomes imprinted upon the brain in a very tailored, individuated way. It has commonalities across all people who suffer from chronic pain, but highly individual features, especially affected by one's memory of pain, one's emotional response to pain, and then the cognitive elements of pain. And we all know this intuitively or from experience because we've seen people suffer pain who are able to do extraordinary things in spite of that pain. And we see others who have very bleak memories and very emotional responses to pain who can't function nearly as well in the presence of pain. So the Veterans Administration began to look very carefully at how we approach pain and realized that the interplay between how the brain operates, especially emotional, psychological dimensions, as well as the tissue-based healing dimensions, meant they had to be broader in their approach and began to look at other ways to treat pain that could be evidence-based, meaning that they had been subjected to scientific studies. We in the Department of Defense, influenced by and learning from our veteran colleagues, were seeing the same thing. And we learned, especially through a period of 20 years of protracted combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, that in which a lot of not only combat wounds, but I think the audience will recognize that anytime you mobilize a large number of young men and women to fight and defend, you're going to have training injuries, you're going to have sports injuries, you're going to have motor vehicle accidents. We've probably had as many amputations, quite frankly, from motorcycle accidents as we have from combat IEDs and blasts. And so we realized, especially across 3 continents, and with an evacuation and treatment chain that stretches 8,000 miles, that we were highly reliant on pharmacology, on the use of drugs, especially opioids and psychotropic drugs for relaxation and stress reduction and the like. And that over-reliance then, number one, wasn't as successful as we hoped it would be for the treatment of chronic pain, but it also got us in serious trouble with problems of addiction, of accidental deaths. We're losing as many people from accidental overdoses from opioids with or without associated benzodiazepine and other psychotropics as we lose on the highways every year. And so we, in the Department of Defense, along with the VA's leadership, began looking at other evidence-based approaches and found that there are 8 or 9 very, very sound practices when applied to chronic pain, which have as much, if not more, impact and are as effective as are these pharmacologic agents. And I'll real quickly just enumerate some of them: acupuncture, mindfulness meditation, chiropractic, deep tissue massage, the ancient Asian practices of Tai Chi and Qigong, probably as well, movement practices, yoga, music therapy. These have all been found to be as effective, if not in some cases much more so, than the use of pharmacology. And so the Veterans Administration has undertaken an enormously positive approach to the promotion of health among their beneficiaries, almost 10 million in number, to promote what they call a whole health approach to health that begins with a mindfulness-based approach to one's health, but if pain is involved, extends to them a whole series of evidence-based so-called complementary and integrative practices in addition to the pharmacology. And I'll end there and ask if you have other follow-ons.
It does sound interesting because what you're talking about is basically on a smaller scale is done in an interdisciplinary pain clinic where we're looking at whole body approach and the biopsychosocial model of pain. And
you're absolutely right.
Yeah, so this is, of course, takes it on a larger scale. And I think for our audience too, who may not know, but in Canada we have a public healthcare system, where in the U.S. it's private. So if I understand you correctly, someone who leaves the service in the U.S., if they're injured or not, would fall under the VA for their healthcare benefits. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. If one serves for a period of time and is separated honorably, then they're entitled to healthcare within the VA, as well as other benefits like education and the like. The majority of veterans also tap into private health care if they, for example, have post-service employment that has a health care associated with it, or in my case, if they've served on active duty and retired within the military, they can remain on military health care. But you're exactly right that in the main, veterans are entitled to health and health benefits. And the VA is extending, and this is probably the closest thing in the U.S. that we have to your system of national health care, because both the DOD and the VA, each of which has close to 10 million beneficiaries, extends itself through a government program for health promotion and health care delivery. Yes.
So with the VA in the U.S., I understand there are VA hospitals throughout the country that people would go to. So are there interdisciplinary pain clinics within those hospitals, or is it something new? Because you're talking about the holistic approach or alternative medicine. I remember we talked before that you don't call it alternative medicine anymore. You call it something different.
That's right.
So so two parts to that question. Are there interdisciplinary pain clinics in all the VA hospitals? And is there a holistic approach when a veteran goes into all VA hospitals, as you're talking about? Like, is it a complete culture change that they're undergoing right now?
No, I think that's a very astute insight and question on your part, Tom, because that's exactly what's happening. The VA, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, health and healthcare institution within the United States, it rivals in size, much like the Department of Defense's healthcare system, rivals any one of the very largest private organizations that we have delivering health promotion and health care within the United States. And they were mandated a number of years ago as a consequence of this transformational effort to provide a multidisciplinary, team-based, patient-centered approach to health promotion for all veterans who elect to enter into it. It's called Veterans Whole Health. For any of your audience, you can easily access that through any of the search engines and just ask for U.S. Veterans Affairs or U.S. VA Whole Health, and you'll see a description of that. And this was an insight that we needed to change the focus of how we approached the veteran from one that dwelled almost exclusively on their disabilities and the limitations that have health and injury and the like imposed upon them. That is, what's the matter with you? They've changed this through a major transformational cultural effort to ask the veteran, what matters to you as you enter into this phase of your life, the veteran's journey? What matters to you, and how can we facilitate your achieving whatever those goals you may have in this latter phase of your life? And if health issues are there, how can we remove those obstacles that are impeding your achieving the goals that you have? And so this whole health approach, if it includes pain as a problem, and pain is just one of many things, and sometimes it's education, sometimes it's employment, sometimes it's homelessness, sometimes it's drug and alcohol problems, sometimes it's family discord, sometimes it's emotional or psychological burdens. Whatever might be the obstacles to achieving what matters to you as a veteran, they are attacking that through this multidisciplinary team-based approach. If pain is involved in this, then that same multidisciplinary approach, which you called the biopsychosocial model, which ironically is 50 to 60 years old, began in the Northwest, University of Washington in Seattle, began a major program on this in formulating based upon this biopsychosocial approach, biologic bases, psychological ramifications or interactions, and the social interactions, because people in chronic pain or people with any chronic illness have a major impact upon their social interactions, their interpersonal interactions, family discord, unemployment, problems that might occur as a consequence of that. So this biopsychosocial model, which began 50 to 60 years ago, began with the formation of these multidisciplinary clinics, has really faltered and struggled because the business model of American healthcare especially has not lent itself to supporting that. And we've drifted away from that. The VA and now the Department of Defense have rediscovered the importance of that and have invested enormous effort institutionally, corporately, as well as financially in that. And now, under the VA mandate, every major center within the Veterans Administration, which is enormous, has got to have a multidisciplinary approach to this. I'd like to just comment real quickly, because you brought it up, that many of us have now moved away from thinking of this as an alternative space for care, as if we're building a separate parallel universe of care. We'd like to rather think of this as integrating the very best evidence-based approaches, some of which are thousands of years old, like yoga and acupuncture, into the mainstream of conventional care. And I think if we were to come back in 20, 30 years, what we'd see is they've become conventional care, and there's a whole new generation of these integrative complementary practices which are being evaluated to be brought in, if that makes sense to you.
Oh, it makes total sense. And when you talk about the biosocial model, we think about up here too is the transition or the military mindset and culture that veterans face too. We say, I've worked with many U.S. soldiers in my time, and I think there's not much difference there of its mission first and self last. And that really, many soldiers don't understand that. It's quite normal, but when they leave the service, it does have an impact, especially when it comes to chronic pain. So I would think if you're like the VA that's putting in on a larger scale, looking at both the psycho and the social model of, how does somebody integrate back into society? Is this something they look at too, is how military mindset and identity impacts a person moving from a very institutionalized culture back into the civilian world? I know it never leaves us, but how do we deal with it? Are they working with that part as well?
Yeah, I think at the root of what you're saying, I would totally agree with, and that is, as I spent 41 years as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, some of it in reserve time, but the majority over 33 years as an active duty officer, and working with my colleagues and including Canadian forces, for whom I have enormous respect. Seeing them around the world, we have a predisposition to think only in the physical domain. We're supposed to be capable of achieving the mission as long as we are structurally, if you want to call it that, intact. I think what these wars, among all others, have proven to us beyond a shadow of a doubt is the very important feature of the human dimension of the experience of service, and especially when subjected to combat or any of the strains and pressures and stresses that occur as a consequence of mobilization, of deployment, whether it be for a humanitarian effort, a natural disaster, a man-made event, or armed conflict. They all have an impact on our psychology. When you add to that the problems of sleep deprivation, temptation to use drugs or alcohol to alleviate some of the stresses and the pressures that we experience, I think we begin to see where the psychological dimension enters into this. Heretofore, we've looked at people who suffered from the psychological impacts of this and have labeled them somehow as a second-class citizen in uniform. We attached labels like combat stress and shell shock and other things that were attendant to both the physical injuries, oftentimes traumatic brain injuries, head injuries from trench warfare in World War I or from bombardments in World War II in Korea, and somehow separated that from what were thought of as more, again, for lack of a better term, soldierly injuries that you could physically see and measure. We're now beginning to see in no uncertain terms that the interaction between the psychology and the physical dimension is extraordinarily important and needs to be dealt with equally well. I've seen T-shirts that some soldiers and Marines wear that say that pain is weakness leaving the system, as if those of us who suffer from pain are somehow weaker than those that don't, despite the fact that pain is a universal human experience. And I think we're trying very hard to leave that mentality behind.
But that's what gets us through some of the tough times in service. And there's so much more we can unpack with this, Eric. And but we know we've come to the end of the show, and it always goes by quickly. So I'd like to thank you for your insights. And it sounds like, to take it on that large of a scale with the VA and defense, to look at a whole person approach, I think probably has some good legs on it, and will help a lot of people. So thanks for your time on this.
Thank you, Tom.
So for our listeners, if you have any feedback about the show or more information on chronic pain, you can visit our website, veteranschronicpain.ca, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Chronic Pain COE, and on Instagram at chronicpain_COE. We're getting a lot of feedback on the show and a lot of questions, so keep them coming. And we'll look forward to the next episodes for the following season. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.
This is Story Studio Network.